Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here on a Sunday evening. Thank you, those of you who are watching from near and far. It really is a pretty special occasion here for many reasons, some of which we're going to get into in a few minutes in our conversation, but also a special occasion to see the store reopen for this kind of event. It's been open for a while for customers. I want to thank Malaprops. It's hard to find words to thank Malaprops, but could we please just give them a round of applause? And I'd also like to celebrate our very feisty community here in Western North Carolina. I know some of you have come in from other areas for this reading. We're very grateful. Tim and I were talking about roads a lot and getting here as we met before this presentation. And boy, do we have a great region. Well, we have a region that fights to rebuild, and I'm just so proud of all of us. So, and this is a very appropriate book to celebrate that moment with. So I'm going to say just a few words about UNC Press before we start our presentation. And then I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing Timothy Silver, our author for this evening. UNC Press 2 years ago celebrated its 100th anniversary. It was the first press of its kind in the entire Southern United States. We have other press authors here tonight, and we who work with the press, I sit on the Advancement Council for the Press, we're very proud of being associated with it, and we hope that you will explore its catalog, its books. There's really kind of something for everyone in the UNC Press catalog. Everything from gardening and botany and walking the mountains to big sociological issues, and lots of history. And you're going to hear a little bit of that tonight. It is a press that represents North Carolina not only in the state, but in the country and in the world. And it is a press that publishes a book every 3 days. These are very high quality books, and it's still kind of amazing to me that a press can bring out books as beautiful as this every 3 days. It also is a source of very carefully vetted information. These are books that are beautifully, meticulously peer-reviewed, fact-checked in an age of lots of divisiveness and misinformation and disinformation on every side of the political spectrum. These are books you can read. You can be sure that they have been very, very beautifully checked for fact. And they're fascinating. And a lot of them are really great to look at too. So I encourage you to look up UNC Press. They also make great holiday gifts. We like to say that at this time of year. So does this book here. So I have the pleasure of introducing Timothy Silver. I didn't know Tim before today, and I got to sit and talk with him for a while before this started, and it was really fun. We had lots of interests in common. And I also have even more respect for a really wonderful author and educator. I loved reading this book. I guarantee you will find it a gripping and moving story. Another meticulously researched book. It's also a great human story and a pretty sad story in a lot of ways. So we will be talking about that. I want to just say a few words about him, and I won't go on and on because his biography is long and very interesting. First of all, it's relevant to this book that Tim Silver's people, as we often say here in the mountains, came from Mitchell County. And he grew up in a military family, moving around quite a bit. He was born in Marion and really came of age in Raleigh, it seemed like. And you really discover that in this book too, in the parts of it that are more personal. But I think it's significant that you are from here in the mountains, very much so. And of course, we did a lot of hurricane sharing while we were sitting there talking. And Tim lives in Boone now. He's a professor emeritus of history at App State. And Boone, as you know, was also hit with immense flooding. So this is a kind of unusual situation too. At UNC Press, we love having multiple time authors to interview and introduce. And this is Tim's third book with UNC Press. A previous one was called Mount Mitchell and the Black Mountains, an environmental history of the highest peaks in Eastern America, that came out in 2003. And it won a 2004 Philip D. Reed Memorial Award from the Southern Environmental Law Center, and a 2003 Old North State Award from the North Carolina Literary and Historical Association. He then co-authored and published a book I admire a lot personally, An Environmental History of the Civil War, which was published in 2020 and co-authored with Judkin Browning. And that one was named an American Library Association Choice Magazine Outstanding Academic Title in 2021. Congratulations on all that, by the way. And if there's a little bit of time, I'd selfishly love to hear a little bit about what it was like to write that book, co-author that book, but I imagine that would take several hours. We'll see. You can probably already tell from these titles that Dr. Silver specializes in several areas. One is the environmental history of North America, particularly the South and Southern Appalachia, as well as the history of America's national and state parks. And I know there are hikers here and campers, and we love having those areas. He also has special interest in the ethnohistory of early America. So all of this is deep background for the book you'll hear about today. I think it probably added a lot to your experience of writing this book, that you know all of this area so well. I can only imagine. So I'd like to jump right in with some questions, but I'd also like to say that we love Q&A here at Malaprops, and I hope that you will think about your own questions, save them up, and ask them in the last part of this hour, because we have a real tradition of discussion here. It doesn't just have to be me or us talking at you. So please do save up your questions. So this book, which has just come out, I'm in the midst of a hurricane, right? Tim was telling me while we were talking that one of his previous books, well, the Civil War book, came out in April 2020. Everybody remember April 2020, a month into the pandemic. And this one has come right in the middle of a hurricane. And he was wondering, would anybody pay him to not write another book?
Yeah, I was gonna say, when is the next one coming?
I'm open to offers.
So, but this beautifully produced book, Death in Briar Bottom, the true story of hippies, mountain lawmen, and the search for justice in the early 1970s. And I understand there are people here in the audience who heard a lot about this book or helped with it in some way before it went to press. So Tim, I'd like to ask you, it sounds as if this topic has been with you for a long time, and that is part of this story. In fact, since right after the events it chronicles took place. Could you do a couple things for us, if you wouldn't mind? And one is to tell us some basic information about the book and the story, and kind of set the scene for us. But another one is, if you could tell us about the moment this book suddenly became a book in your mind, or not so suddenly, maybe.
Yeah, well, can everybody hear me? I'm not gonna use the mic, and I have former students here who will attest that I have an adequate volume of voice. This book really took me 50 years to write, I think is a fair statement. It's about an incident that occurred in 1972 in Yancey County, a group of 24 young people from near Clearwater, Florida, were on their way to see the Rolling Stones in Charlotte. And this is 1972. The Stones were touring behind Exile on Main Street at the height of their popularity. So these 24 young people got the idea that it would be a good idea, that they would want, might be a good idea to camp out in the North Carolina mountains on their way to see the Rolling Stones. Long story short, they ran afoul of the local sheriff there. A 12 gauge shotgun went off, and one of them ended up dead. And so the book is that story, along with their 3-year quest to get someone held responsible for that incident. So it's a story of a killing, and a story of trials, and a story of kids who lived through this trauma. They were all between the ages of 16 and 26 at the time. So it stayed with them. And it stayed with me. I was 17, and I always like to say when I talk about this, I was not always the well-coiffed, distinguished-looking senior citizen who sits before you today. In 1972, I had hair to my shoulders. I was in pretty good shape as far as the teenager goes. I had a car, had a job, and I thought I needed only one thing to make my life complete, and that was a ticket to see the Rolling Stones in Charlotte on July 6, 1972. And I wanted to go, and my parents said no. So when I found out about this incident, it just sort of, buried itself in my subconscious, my conscious mind for a long time. And I never forgot about it. And in the intervening years, I spent a lot of time in Yancey County. I wrote about Mount Mitchell, spent a lot of time camping in Briar Bottom with Dan Pierce, among others. And, I decided when I retired that it was time to get into this thing and take a look at it and see if there was a story there. And the story turned out to be much better than I had anticipated and much more involved. I told Elizabeth when we were talking that if you read a lot of these boomer memoirs, they're sort of, fist in the air type things. I was a badass in the 60s sort of memoir, that wasn't me at all. In the early 70s, I was as self-absorbed as any teenager, and spent my time hanging out with friends and doing things that confess in the book. But anyway, that's how it came to happen. And, I never forgot it because I was so deeply involved with it at the time. And I could easily identify with those kids who saw their outing to see the Rolling Stones go so horribly wrong. And, I promised myself I was going to do it, and I did it.
And it's an extraordinary piece of research. I'd love to talk about that in a moment. Could you, was there a moment when this shifted from kind of lingering memory or even occasional obsession in your mind to a book project?
Yeah, I wasn't sure it could be a book when I started. I thought maybe it could be a short story or an article or something like that. But the more I got into it, the more I realized all the issues of the time that this touched upon. And there were also some really important legal figures from North Carolina involved in this, including the attorney Julius Chambers, who, if you know his name, is an African-American attorney who won the landmark case, Swan versus the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, argued it before the Supreme Court, and that set the federal policy of using busing to achieve school equality. And so once I found out he was involved, and then I discovered Adam Stein was also involved. That name sounds familiar. His son was just elected governor of North Carolina. So once I found out all these people were involved, I was sort of, whoa, you know, what kind of a comet's tail have I latched onto here? And so I think that's when it started to become a book, when I realized how much it touched on a national scene. It wasn't just a local story or even a state story. It was actually a national story. So.
One of the things I love about this book is that Tim did a tremendous job of moving from the very personal, that just a moment in his own life, without making the book about himself. Really, it's really about all these other people, but beautifully from a moment in his own life to this huge, national scene of a lot of different things: drugs, sex, and rock and roll, but also national policies, Vietnam War, a lot of very, very important things in our history. And I'd like to talk about that, but I wondered if you could further set the scene for us just by reading a
Sure.
short passage. So the book has an epilogue that describes the incident the tragedy at Briar Bottom near Black Mountain Campground. And it is a very powerful epilogue. It's quite a few pages long, so we made the difficult decision of not sharing it. Also, you get to read it for yourself. But then he starts in on why you wrote this book. And I would love for you to share that part with us, if you'd be willing.
Sure. I think you're referencing the prologue, which is.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did I say epilogue? It's been a long hurricane. I meant the prologue. That's why Dan Pierce was smiling.
I'm gonna have to dig my glasses out here. I got them. Never go anywhere without them. There's an audio version of the book coming, and so I'm gonna try not to read like the guy in the audio. I mean, I like the way he reads. I got nothing against it, but I'll just read in my style here. 2 days after that shotgun went off in Briar Bottom, I woke mid-morning at my home in Raleigh, some 240 miles away. That summer, at age 17, I worked the afternoon shift at a local A&P supermarket, and usually spent my mornings lounging around the house, reading the Raleigh News and Observer. Since I rarely stirred before 10 a.m., my father always went through the newspaper first, and then put the pages back together for me. But on that day, he left the Observer open to page 8, where I could not help but notice a bold headline: Florida youth slain at Yancey campsite. Wondering why the paper had been left in such unaccustomed disarray, I started reading. 5 paragraphs in, a single line stopped me cold. Stan Altland and his friends had gone on an outing to camp in the mountains and later attend a Rolling Stones concert in Charlotte. A couple months earlier, when I learned that the Rolling Stones were coming to Charlotte, I had begged my parents to let me go. I'd promised to pay all my expenses, including a hotel room for the night. Parental verdict was a resounding no, and I was crushed. For weeks, I'd imagined what it would be like to be on the road with a couple friends, windows down, music blaring, worried about nothing except getting to the concert on time. Instead, with the big event now a day away, I sat at home in a deep adolescent funk, anticipating nothing more than another afternoon of bagging groceries and mopping floors. My father knew all that when he left the News and Observer open that morning. He wanted to make sure that I saw what happened to those kids from Clearwater. He could not know that their story would become so deeply entwined with my own.
That's great, thank you. So I mentioned research a couple of times, and you mentioned feeling that you kind of got hold of a comet's tail. You also said this afternoon it was like pulling a vine out of a wall and just finding it connected to more and more and more, this one story. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could tell us, first of all, how you went about that research, and then some of the more surprising moments in it.
Yeah, the research started with the internet's a wonderful thing, and this is, I've thought about this would have been impossible to do without the internet. The internet's a wonderful thing, and newspapers.com is a wonderful source on the internet. So I started reading about this event on newspapers.com, and of course I could get papers from North Carolina, Florida, all over the place to read about it. And once I had a sort of an idea of what had happened, I decided to begin to contact eyewitnesses. And oddly enough, in a time when you can email and instant message and all that, I started writing these sort of old-fashioned letters to people. Found them on the internet, white pages, wonderful kind of thing if you're tracking people down. Be pretty sure I had the right person, and I wrote these kind of long letters. Didn't have a book contract or anything to set, I'm looking into this event. And for about a month, absolutely nothing happened. And I thought to myself, wow, maybe this isn't such a good idea. And I was out riding my bike one day, and my telephone rang. It said Cheyenne, Wyoming. And I knew that one of those kids now lived in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And so I talked with him, and in short order, I talked with some other people, and then I got rolling, and I made several trips to Yancey County, where my good friend Danny McIntosh was my county guide. And then I made a trip to Clearwater to meet with these people and interview them a little bit further. And that was interesting. There's a sudden realization that you're writing about real people, and you have to get this right. These aren't people who died in the 19th century. If you don't get it right, they'll know it. I would say a couple of surprising things happened. One of which was the first trial. The sheriff charged all these kids with disorderly conduct and took them to jail in Burnsville. And they had to come back for a trial. And that first trial was in district court, which typically means there is no court reporter present. And a judge decides the case. That was fine with Julius Chambers. He didn't want a jury from Yancey County anyway. But typically there's no court reporter. So I thought I was going to write the story of that trial mainly from the newspapers and from what the witnesses remembered. But the guy who got killed, his brother, Roger Altland, kept telling me that there was a transcript of this trial. And I thought, I didn't know what he was talking about. And then finally he calls me one day and said, I found that transcript of the trial. I'm like, yeah, right. There's no transcript of a district court trial. And he said, I'm gonna send it to you. And so, not wanting to alienate him, I said, okay, sure, Roger, send it on, whatever I don't know if he's watching or not, but I said, send it on, see what you got. And son of a gun, I get this package from Florida, and I open it up, and there's like a 400-page transcript of this trial in an old Blue Horse binder, if you're old enough to remember those from your school days. And it had been sitting in someone's garage for 50 years. And come to find out, one of the kids' parents had paid a court reporter to be present. And she was a bona fide court reporter, and she had signed. And so, I don't know, in 40 years as a professional historian, nothing like that. So it just doesn't happen. You don't find these kind of unused sources that turn up at the right moment. But it did, and that was a huge help, and just something that animated the whole project. The second thing, there was an FBI investigation of the incident. And I thought getting an FBI report would be fairly easy. Freedom of Information Act, to just write and ask for it. So I wrote the FBI very politely, and I said, I'd like to report on the Stan Altland case. To get this letter from FBI headquarters that says, you're not a relative, you're not directly involved in this. So we won't either confirm nor deny that we have such a report. So I thought, okay, I'll get some of Stan's relatives. So I got his brother Roger, his brother David. I said, you all write and ask for this thing. They did. They got exactly the same letter, even though they were his brothers. They got the same letter, essentially the same letter from the FBI. So at that point, I appealed the case and wrote what can only be described as a white-hot narrative to the FBI about the injustice of it all. And it took about 2 years, but then I found out I was in the National Archives. I thought, great, I know the National Archives. I'm inches away from that report. Well, I got in touch with the archives and they said, yeah, we got it. And yes, you can see it, but you're gonna have to wait 3 years and 3 months until we vet it. And I'm staring at a book deadline, you know, I don't have 3 years and 3 months. So at that point, in an act of sheer desperation, I picked up the telephone and called my Congresswoman, Virginia Fox. Still scarred from biting my lip when I was doing that. Anyway, and to be fair, I got somebody in her office who was really helpful. I swore that I was the victim of a giant government conspiracy, and you know, I got somebody who's really helpful. And in essence, what I had to do is cut a deal with the archives. They let me see 10 of the FBI interviews, and I had to withdraw my request to see the whole report. So I was able to get that. So that's, you know, a couple of things that just really fell in line there after some effort, but that's the research process. You know, if you need something from the FBI, you better start now.
So that really points to, those two stories really point to a couple of things that I really noticed in your narrative in this book when you talked about the research. And one of the great things you get in this book is Tim's detective story of trying to get all this information. And in fact, Danny is a star in it, I'd say. And so lots of help from other people. But one thing you encountered lots of very forthcoming people and sources, and also some people who wanted to lay this to rest, it sounded like, in different ways. This was a very traumatic event for a lot of people. But you've expressed in the book that you often encountered some wariness, and you encountered it in a lot of different directions. And there is a mystery about what happened that day. It was a very controversial event in Yancey County. It wasn't an isolated event in our country's history at that moment. But could you talk a little bit about that wariness and what forms it took and why you think it was there?
Yeah, you know, I had this idea that I was just going to go around in Yancey County and, you know, show up at some country stores and gas stations and, you know, suck up to people and get them to talk to me. Didn't work out that way, really. People were very reluctant to talk. And a couple times I just lost my nerve before I ever got to asking about the event itself. And I think it's partly because people don't want you to stir up bad memories. I mean, I think that's part of it. And part of it is that, you know, they still remember that time as a very difficult, sort of violent time in history. And kicking all that around again, even though I told them I'm a historian, I don't really have any agenda, I just want to tell the story. It was difficult to get people to talk, but not impossible. And, you know, with some help from Danny and some other people in Yancey County, I was able to get enough information to do it, along with the newspapers. And Danny put me onto the local paper, which I read and was fascinated by its accounts of the event. So there's that. So I think it's just a general sort of, you know, why do we need to go back to this again? You know, let's put it behind us and move on.
Yeah. Well, definitely a painful topic. And one of the things that you do throughout this book is talk about that incident and in the context of our country's history and of that moment and these different culture clashes, including there in Yancey County. Could you just tell us a little bit about what the culture clash was like that was behind this this encounter getting out of control? Some of it was pretty surprising to me, and I remember 1972. So,
yeah, I think people forget. I mean, today we talk about culture wars, and that's the term the press uses, and we think that's a recent phenomenon that's been going on, you know, for a very long time in American history, maybe from the beginning of American history. And nobody used that term in the early 70s. I never heard it in the early 70s, but there was this pretty sharp divide that's not unlike the divide in the country now. It was urban, rural. It was young and older, black and white. And it, you know, it made for a very contentious time in American history. You had school integration, mandatory busing, which became the law for at least a short while. And white people very nervous about their children going to school with black children. You had George Wallace running for president twice in 68 and 72, promising that if he got elected, black children would never go to school with whites or vice versa. Vietnam, although the war, American involvement ended the next year, it showed no signs of ending in 1972. In fact, in the spring of 72, Nixon had cranked up the bombing again and mined Haiphong Harbor, and there was a lot of protest. And you had groups like the Weathermen and the Black Panthers who were trying to foment worldwide revolution. One of the things I remember particularly is the sort of spate of bombings. I mean, every day there was like a bombing somewhere or an attempted bombing. I got so, they would tell the theater audience, if you were at the movies, that there was a bomb threat and people wouldn't even get up. It was just a matter of course, oh, okay, another bomb threat, so it was a very violent time. And I think that was the clash. This was in microcosm. Young kids, the men had long hair, men and women together, not married. They were drinking, smoking marijuana, that clashed with the establishment view of kids as troublemakers. They've come into our county, they're creating havoc. And I think that a lot of that was a culture sort of clash between the two.
We talked a little bit about this book as a book about fear and also about loss of innocence. And I wonder if you could describe those young people who were there in Yancey County that night. You learned an awful lot about them. In fact, you met some of them and took them back there with you.
It's an interesting story. They were what I would call free living types in 1972. A fair number of them lived at this little complex on the outskirts of Clearwater called the Bungalows. And at one time, the bungalows were housing for migrant workers, but the agricultural boom in Florida was over and it turned into cheap apartments. And so a substantial number of the group lived there. And they did sort of whatever they wanted to do there. They threw very raucous parties, particularly on certain Sunday afternoons. The party would be announced on the radio and kids would turn up from all over the surrounding area to, listen to rock and roll and smoke dope and, drink together. It's a great picture of that in the book. They had just sort of gotten used to doing as they pleased. And they were generally nice kids from good families. They had jobs. They were not, so as one person said, they were not greaseball hippies. They were nice kids for the most part, but they had just gotten used to sort of doing whatever they pleased. And they thought they could just go to the mountains and find a place off away from everybody and take the show on the road, in essence. And, they got to Yancey County. The people there at the campgrounds had different ideas. They rolled up in a 7-vehicle caravan, 6 cars and a Volkswagen van, music blaring, etc. And naturally, that didn't sit too well with the local rangers and the local constabulary. They were not amused.
One of the amazing things about this book is that as you read it, a lot of things start to sound familiar or similar to some of the things we struggle with in our very complicated society at this time. And I know it's a big job for an author to connect to all these larger pictures, but I think you did a tremendous, made a tremendous book out of it. Were there moments when you as a writer had to make decisions about how much to tell about the national scene? Or I learned a lot about rock and roll, which I wasn't allowed to listen to in 1872, but I learned a lot about it from this book. Were there moments when you had to think as a writer, okay, do I want to go down this road, or how far do I want to go?
Yeah, and I have to give my editor, Lucas Church, a lot of credit for sort of keeping me on the straight and narrow. Lucas's favorite line was, "The story, Tim, the story." You know? Don't go down these rabbit holes. So I had some of the original drafts had a lot more about rock music in there, and some lyrics which I thought were real important. You know, Lucas is like, no.
I'm sure they were.
Well, to me they were, but and he's like, no. You know, some more stuff about the background of Vietnam, and Lucas is like, everybody knows what Vietnam was. You don't have to recount the history here. So he's very good at keeping me out of those rabbit holes and, you know, helping me make those kinds of decisions. One of the toughest decisions I had to make was whether and how I was going to relate this to the present day. And I have students here who've heard me say this, that the real lesson of history is that things change. There's a Greek philosopher, Heraclitus, who said you can't step into the same river twice because it's not the same river and you're not the same person. And so if you start, you know, looking for too many parallels, I think you can get into trouble. But I was taken, and partly because of the timing of the book when I was writing it, I was taken with parallels between this and the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd. Now, let me quickly add that these middle-class white kids did not experience anything like George Floyd or any African-American experience growing up in the South. But I think there's a link there in that they both faced adversarial policing. At least that's what I would call it. And so I sort of allude to that in the end. And there's some things there that really ring true, like contempt of cop. That phrase about if you don't respect a police officer, you know, they tend to get mean with you and nasty with you. And you know, that was part of the story. So I was very careful about doing that, but I think it's a valid parallel. And in some ways, we haven't learned a lot about policing since 1972.
I was glad as a reader that you did go down that particular road, and I thought you did it leaving a lot, you know, for the reader to explore too. But I think it would have been quite an omission, actually, if you hadn't touched on that in this moment we're in now. And I was also really fascinated by how many threads from the story come forward into our moment now. You know, we've got this area that you were in Burnsville, in Micaville, and lots of these places in Yancey County. They just got hammered in the hurricane, and they've been in the news a lot. And last year, we had a speaker here for the Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration in Asheville, which is a very big multiracial celebration. In fact, it's the biggest one outside Atlanta. And if you all haven't been to it, I really recommend the big breakfast they hold. It's a wonderfully joyful morning, and with people from all walks of life. And our speaker there was James Ferguson, who worked with Julius Chambers and was sort of the third in command there in that law firm. And Josh Stein was actually there with him. And James Ferguson said, "I'd like to introduce Josh Stein. He's my son." And everybody went, "What?" But then he explained longtime friendships through this law firm, and Josh Stein had grown up with Julius Chambers and James Ferguson, and of course his dad, Adam. So you know, we have a lot of, this is not a story that feels remote in a lot of ways. And I want to open it to questions now, but I also want to just really congratulate you on doing a phenomenal job with very difficult material, with living people and painful memories, and a lot of respect for people, for all people in this book. And I admire that very much. Do we have a few questions? I'm sure we do. Yes, sir.
I was too young for drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and now I'm too old.
So am I.
But I remember the camping scene in Easy Rider being one of my early, not so much maybe the end, but the camping scene in the middle was like, and so I've been sensitized ever since then. I think probably the strongest parallel that I'm thinking of is the kid who was killed at Cop City protest. Miguel Torres, I think this is his name. But that was almost, it seems like that was a very strong parallel here, more so than some of the other cop shootings that's happened in the past.
I mean,
Did that one, when you heard about that one, did that?
Yeah, and there were a couple of others too. That one I'm not super familiar with, but I did get familiar with the killing in Ruidoso, New Mexico, where a kid allegedly tried to run from the cops and they fired a warning shot, hit him in the back of the head. And there was another incident in Colorado where this hippie kid just disappeared, and they found this body in a nearby county, and they immediately suspected the local marshal of killing him because he had said, you know, the best thing we can do with these hippies is to shoot the bastards. And but he never got in any trouble until he had an attack of conscience later in life and admitted to killing the kid. So there, I mean, but there were those kinds of things were all around, and so yeah.
I think the one in Cop City was in April or March this year. It's still working its way.
Yeah.
Were the authorities, the police that had been involved or worked for the local agency, were they suspicious of what your take was and where you were going?
If you don't mind, let me just repeat the question for our virtual audience. So the great question was, were local law authorities suspicious still of what was involved and what you were doing poking around in this?
Yeah.
Tell them about the sheriff's department.
Yeah. Well, the answer to that question is I don't know, because you know, I'm a historian and I like all kinds of evidence, and more evidence the better. So I wrote the sheriff's still alive that led the raid. And I wrote 3 certified letters to him, to his brother, who's also still alive and was on the raid. I wrote his son, who later became sheriff of Yancey County, and his nephew, who is now the DA in my county. So there's some significant family ties here. I never heard from the sheriff or his brother. His son left a telephone message for me, said, I don't have any records that go back past 1991. And he didn't answer a follow-up letter. My DA in my county had his secretary call me and say it all happened before his time, and he didn't have anything to do with it. So I actually don't know. And
Except for the sheriff's department car.
well, yeah, Dan is convinced that the sheriff kept driving by our campsite in Briar Bottom.
Every day. I mean, it was.
It did seem a little bit, you know, odd, but
Did you all have long hair at that point?
This was like 2 years ago.
I know, I'm just joking.
It did, and there's a group of us that camped there, and they made it clear to me that after the book came out, I would be camping at a different site from the rest of them. So, yeah, no, I honestly don't know how they feel about it. I suspect, you know, they don't want to talk about it. But I tried my best to, and Danny will vouch for that, to get them to talk. So
You were able to work around their story.
yeah, I did get the sheriff's interview with the FBI, so that was that was very helpful. And then he was not shy about talking to the press at the time either. So, I mean, and the Florida papers were kind of all over this thing. So that was good. Yeah.
What, if any, mysteries remain from the case for you? Are there any gnawing questions that'll haunt you that you'll either pursue or just have given up on?
So the question was, what are the mysteries that remain in this case? And are there any gnawing questions you have still?
You mean ones that I can talk about, right? There is, I think, a question, not so much in my mind, but the question was raised at the time as to whose gun fired the fatal shot. And I make a determination about that based on the evidence and say, you know, we may never know that for certain, but here's what we do know. And so it goes that way. And I think the other thing that kind of lingers with me is why the local ranger there at the campground felt the need to immediately call the sheriff. He could have gone and asked the kids to be quiet. He didn't do it. He stood and watched and got thoroughly disgusted with what he saw, I think. And then he went and called the sheriff, and that escalated things. So that's one thing I don't get him, the local ranger there, what he was doing.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Is the ranger still alive?
He is not. No.
The ranger is not still
No, he's
alive.
not still alive. No.
Yes.
So, a little bit of background. I grew up in communist Bulgaria and got the late introduction to American music from the 70s and 80s. But it did rock our world towards the end of the 80s and falling into the Berlin Wall. I wasn't quite familiar with the Rolling Stones, more into Queen and Pink Floyd and
Right.
and and the music from Hair. I'm just curious about the connection between the music, the cultural scene that had been budding out for so long, and the cultural clash that happened that day, which was probably happening all over, but this seems to be the focal point here.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do in the book, and I think I was pretty successful at it, was to sort of use this Rolling Stones tour as a flashpoint for the cultural clash that culminated in this death of Briar Bottom. And you got to realize that the Stones, their concerts were notorious for violence and death. In fact, the tour previous to this was the one with the famous Altamont concert in 1969, where there were 300 kids there and 4 died on site, including a kid stabbed to death in front of the stage. And violence, even in the 72 tour, followed the Rolling Stones across the country. And I write about that in here. It was, I mean, you know, those were the days when if you didn't have a ticket to a concert, you showed up anyway and figured, you know, you were going to crash the gate or something. And there was sort of open warfare between cops and kids at these concerts. And the Rolling Stones did nothing to discourage that. They would always say, well, you know, the paying customers aren't the problem. It's the rabble that's showing up. But the Stones themselves, a lot of their music focused on street violence and, you know, rejection of authority. I mean, that's rock and roll. Songs like Street Fighting Man, you know, or come right out there, I'll kill the king, you know. Right. So I think all that sort of stirred this, you know, and a Rolling Stones concert was not just another rock concert. It was a time to put that fist in the air and say, you know.
And do you get an impression from your interviews what people remembered about the perceptions at the time among the locals of this new cultural wave?
Yeah, I mean, people in Yancey County knew about hippies. I mean, there was a commune, at least one, maybe more, in Yancey County. One that I was able to document it, a place called the Sunshine Company. And they were back to the landers. They'd come from Detroit to go, live on the land in Yancey County, long hair, whole 9 yards. And actually within the county itself, most local people were okay with it. I mean, some of the local people helped this particular group with their planting and their plowing. And, there was that kind of sort of acceptance among a lot of the local people. The county elite, I would call them, and some people who had recently moved there were the ones who were not okay with it and saw it as a threat to their power and their control. But most of the average citizens of Yancey County, I think, were okay or didn't care one way or another.
So we maybe have time for one more question. Anybody want to ask one? Yes, ma'am.
I'm really curious what it's like coming from historian of history and now doing a more contemporary history and dealing. Can you talk a little, however much you want to talk about the living people that are still behind? You touched on it a little bit, but like what's sticky about that? What's tough about that? Like what do you have to navigate and how is that different than what you're used to in your career?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Stephanie Ronk is one of my former students. She knows how to ask tough questions. I think for me, it was sort of this overwhelming need to get the narrative right. Historians always use their imagination. Whatever they tell you, we have to use our imagination, and we work from sources. And what we try to do is what my mentor called exact imagining. We have to imagine it, but it has to jibe with the sources. And so, one of the problems was sort of describing the way I imagined it with the way they remember it. And trying to make those two things work. And the way human memory works, which I also had to educate myself on, we tend to remember little incidents. We don't remember a kind of linear pattern, but there's certain things we remember very clearly, particularly traumatic events. We can remember those in great detail. So that was the thing for me. That was absolutely brand new. I could look at sources in history, and as I was telling Elizabeth, maybe you write something in history that's not exactly right, and some reviewer in a journal takes you to task and says, no, you didn't get this right, and nobody cares. If you're writing about living people and they say, no, you didn't get this right, or no, I didn't smoke marijuana that night, then you're dealing with something entirely different. So that was the thing for me, was just trying to make those two things work. And, it wasn't easy sometimes. And I still don't think I have the whole truth. I think I've got enough of it to tell the story, but history's always, you've heard me say this, it's like building a house by looking at a few bricks, trying to imagine what that house looked like when you've only got a few bricks. So, that was a problem.
I think that's pretty hard to top as a comment about this book and this process. You've done a fantastic job of bringing this to life, and I know I learned so much from reading it, and want to thank you for being here at Malaprops and kind of, even though we're talking about a tragic story, kind of boosting our spirits as we get back into our community life here. Thank you, and want to especially thank all of you for being here this evening too. So do you want to say a word of thanks
to everybody for turning out, and also to Malaprops? About a month ago, I didn't know if this thing was going to come off or not. And as Elizabeth said, first there was a pandemic, I wrote a book, and then a flood, so now we're missing a swarm of locusts or something. But
yeah, don't do it yet.
Yeah.
We're not ready.
Yeah. So, but I do thank Malaprops for making this happen under difficult circumstances. So thanks.
Thank you all so much. So as Stephanie said, please do purchase your books first. If